On the morning of August 4, 1943, inside a canvas hospital tent near Nicosia, Sicily, a single act by an American general threatened to destroy his career, fracture Allied command, and expose the fragile balance holding the coalition together. The man was Lieutenant General George S. Patton. The victim was a young American soldier suffering from what doctors then called battle fatigue. And the witness was a war correspondent whose report would reach Washington before the week was over. By the evening of that same day, Supreme Allied Commander Dwight D. Eisenhower would already understand the gravity of what had happened. Not just the incident itself, but what it represented. The war in Europe was entering a critical phase. The Allies had just completed their first major invasion of Axis-controlled territory. Every success, every failure, every personality conflict now carried consequences far beyond the battlefield. And Eisenhower would soon be forced to decide whether to destroy one of his most aggressive commanders or protect him at enormous political risk. The slapping incident did not occur in a moment of chaos. It occurred during what should have been a moment of recovery. Patton had entered the hospital tent that morning expecting to see wounded men, shrapnel injuries, amputations, the physical cost of combat. Instead, he encountered Private Charles Cool, a soldier with no visible wounds, trembling, exhausted, and unable to return to the front. When Cool said he was nervous, Patton exploded. He slapped him across the face, shouted that he was a coward, then ordered him sent back to the line. The outburst was not spontaneous. It was ideological. Patton believed deeply that fear was contagious, that tolerance of psychological collapse endangered entire units. What he did not understand or refuse to accept was that the war had already changed beyond the doctrines he learned between conflicts. 9 days later, on August 10th, in another hospital near Palermo, the pattern repeated. This time the soldier was Private Paul Bennett. Again, no visible wounds. Again, exhaustion. Again, Patton struck him, cursed him, and threatened him with execution. Medical staff were horrified. Officers were stunned. Word began to spread. Within days, journalists embedded with Allied forces learned of the incidents. By mid-August, reports reached Eisenhower's headquarters. Eisenhower read them in silence. He did not respond immediately. He did not summon Patton. He did not issue a statement. Eisenhower understood something crucial that others did not. The problem was not just Patton's behavior. The problem was timing. The Allies were preparing for the next phase of the war. Plans for a cross-channel invasion were already being discussed. Command unity was fragile. British and American officers were still negotiating authority, doctrine, and control. Patton was not just a general. He was a symbol of American aggression, speed, and willingness to fight. Removing him outright would satisfy moral outrage. It would also weaken American leverage inside the coalition. Eisenhower's dilemma was immediate and severe. If he defended Patton publicly, he risked appearing to tolerate abuse and brutality. If he relieved Patton, he would remove one of the few commanders capable of offensive warfare at scale. Worse, he would hand British leadership proof that American generals lacked discipline. Eisenhower understood the political implications instantly. The slapping incidents were not merely a disciplinary issue. They were a test of coalition leadership. By August 14th, Eisenhower had verified the reports. He summoned Patton privately. The meeting was tense. Eisenhower did not excuse the behavior. He made it clear that Patton had crossed a line. But he also made something else clear. He was not going to destroy him. Not yet. Instead, Eisenhower imposed punishment without spectacle. Patton was removed from command of the 7th Army. He was ordered to apologize personally to the soldiers involved and to the medical staff who witnessed the incidents. The apologies were humiliating. Patton wept during one of them. He later wrote in his diary that it was the most painful experience of his life. But he was not court-martialed. He was not sent home. He was not publicly disgraced. This decision infuriated many. War correspondents demanded accountability. Members of Congress called for Patton's removal. The American public, once the story became public in November 1943, reacted with shock and anger. Newspapers questioned Eisenhower's judgment. Editorials asked whether the army was protecting its own at the expense of decency. Eisenhower said nothing. He understood that public outrage would fade. What would not fade was the need for commanders capable of decisive action. Eisenhower had watched Patton operate in North Africa. He had seen his ability to restore discipline, move armies rapidly, and exploit enemy weakness. He knew Patton was volatile, arrogant, and often reckless. He also knew that war was not won by cautious men alone. The slapping incidents forced Eisenhower to confront a brutal reality. Modern war demanded leadership that could tolerate imperfection if the alternative was defeat. Eisenhower did not condone Patton's actions, but he refused to allow them to define him. Instead, he isolated the behavior from the capability. That distinction would shape the rest of the war. By late August 1943, Patton was sidelined but not discarded. He was assigned to planning roles. He was kept away from public view. Eisenhower allowed rumors to circulate that Patton was being prepared for future command. This ambiguity was deliberate. It preserved Patton's utility while absorbing political pressure. Eisenhower was buying time. Behind the scenes, Eisenhower defended his decision relentlessly. He argued that Patton's removal would weaken the American army at a critical moment. He reminded Washington that discipline could be enforced without public destruction. He insisted that Patton had learned his lesson. Whether that was true mattered less than whether Patton could still be used. Eisenhower's instincts were confirmed in ways no one could have predicted. By early 1944, Allied planners needed a commander who could deceive the Germans about the location of the coming invasion. They needed someone the enemy feared, someone whose movements would draw attention. Patton was perfect. Eisenhower placed him in command of the fictitious 1st U.S. Army Group, a phantom force designed to convince German intelligence that the invasion would land at Pas de Calais. The deception worked. German reserves remained tied down while the real invasion hit Normandy. This was the moment Eisenhower knew he had been right. Had he destroyed Patton in 1943, the deception would not have carried the same weight. German intelligence would not have been fooled. The invasion might have faced stiffer resistance. Lives would have been lost. Eisenhower had protected Patton not out of favoritism, but foresight. Still, the slapping incidents never disappeared. They followed Patton for the rest of the war. They were raised repeatedly by critics who questioned Eisenhower's judgment. Eisenhower never denied them. He never excused them. He simply refused to let them override strategic necessity. This decision defined Eisenhower as a commander. He was not a tactician like Patton. He was not a planner like Montgomery. He was a coalition leader. His job was to balance personalities, politics, and power. Protecting Patton was not about forgiving misconduct. It was about winning the war. By the time Patton returned to field command in 1944, leading the Third Army across France with unprecedented speed, Eisenhower's gamble paid off. Patton relieved Bastogne. He smashed German defenses. He raced toward the Rhine. The same man who had been nearly destroyed by scandal became indispensable. The slapping incidents remained a stain on Patton's legacy. Eisenhower never denied that, but he understood something his critics did not. War does not offer perfect choices. It offers consequences. Eisenhower chose the consequence he could live with, and in doing so, he ensured that one of the most controversial generals in American history would also become one of its most effective. By the time the slapping incidents became public knowledge in the United States in November 1943, Dwight D. Eisenhower had already spent nearly 3 months managing the consequences in silence. He had done so deliberately. Eisenhower understood that once the story reached American newspapers, the outrage would be immediate, emotional, and unforgiving. What mattered to him was not avoiding criticism, but ensuring that when the criticism arrived, the war effort would already be insulated from its impact. The first headlines framed the story in the harshest possible terms. An American general striking wounded soldiers, threats of execution, abuse of authority. Members of Congress demanded investigations. Editorials questioned whether the army had lost its moral compass. Letters poured into the War Department from families of soldiers who wanted assurances that their sons would not be treated with cruelty if they broke under the strain of combat. The timing could not have been worse. The United States was still shaping its identity as a liberating force, not an occupying one. Stories of brutality threatened that narrative. Eisenhower watched the reaction closely, but he did not retreat. Instead, he reinforced his internal position. Patton would not be destroyed. He would be disciplined, corrected, and used when the time was right. Eisenhower understood that leadership in coalition warfare required absorbing political damage to preserve operational capability. This was not idealism, it was cold calculation. Inside the War Department, senior officers debated Eisenhower's decision. Some argued that Patton should be relieved permanently, not merely sidelined. They warned that protecting him set a dangerous precedent, that it suggested results mattered more than conduct. Eisenhower listened, but he remained unmoved. He responded with a simple truth. Patton's behavior had been unacceptable. Patton's value, however, was undeniable. Removing him would not erase the incidents. It would only weaken the army at a moment when decisive leadership would soon be required. British reaction was more complicated. Officially, British leaders said little. Privately, some saw the incident as confirmation of what they already believed about American commanders. They viewed Patton as reckless, undisciplined, and emblematic of a culture that prioritized speed over control. Montgomery, in particular, regarded the incident as evidence that Patton lacked the moral authority to command large forces. Eisenhower was aware of these views. He also knew that British criticism carried political weight, but he refused to allow British discomfort to dictate American command decisions. This refusal marked a turning point in Eisenhower's leadership. Earlier in the war, he had been careful to accommodate British sensitivities to ensure that American commanders did not appear arrogant or dismissive. By late 1943, that balance was shifting. The United States was providing the majority of men, equipment, and momentum. Eisenhower understood that while Allied unity remained essential, American operational priorities could no longer be subordinate to British preferences. Patton's sidelining was therefore both punishment and preparation. He was kept away from the front lines, denied opportunities for public redemption, and subjected to scrutiny. At the same time, Eisenhower ensured that Patton remained engaged, informed, and available. He understood Patton's psychology well enough to know that idle humiliation would break him. Purpose, even constrained purpose, would keep him functional. Throughout the winter of 1943 and early 1944, Eisenhower corresponded regularly with Washington. In these communications, he defended his handling of the situation with remarkable consistency. He acknowledged Patton's faults openly. He admitted that the incidents had damaged public trust. But he also emphasized that Patton had shown genuine remorse, that he had apologized personally, and that his future conduct would be monitored closely. Eisenhower framed the issue not as forgiveness, but as management. What Eisenhower did not say openly was just as important as what he did. He did not discuss the possibility that Patton might never return to command. He did not frame the sidelining as permanent. He left the door open, deliberately, knowing that circumstances would soon demand decisive action. Those circumstances arrived faster than anyone expected. By early 1944, Allied planners were deep into preparations for the invasion of Western Europe. The success of Operation Overlord depended not only on logistics and firepower, but on deception. German intelligence needed to be convinced that the main invasion would strike at Pass, de Calais rather than Normandy. To make that deception credible, the Allies needed a commander the Germans feared, a name that would draw attention and force them to hold reserves in the wrong place. Patton's reputation, tarnished in American newspapers, remained formidable in German intelligence assessments. The Germans believed Patton was the Allies' most aggressive and dangerous general. Eisenhower recognized this immediately. By February 1944, Patton was placed in command of the fictitious 1st United States Army Group, a phantom force complete with fake radio traffic, dummy tanks, and staged movements. Patton played the role perfectly, making conspicuous appearances and reinforcing German assumptions. The success of this deception validated Eisenhower's earlier decision. Patton's utility extended beyond the battlefield. His very presence shaped enemy behavior. Had Eisenhower destroyed him in 1943, this strategic advantage would have been lost. Eisenhower never said this publicly, but it reinforced his belief that leadership decisions could not be made in isolation from broader strategic consequences. Meanwhile, Patton himself struggled with the aftermath of the slapping incidents. His diary entries from this period reveal a man oscillating between remorse and resentment. He understood that he had crossed a line. He also believed that the modern army was becoming too tolerant of weakness. This internal conflict never fully resolved. Eisenhower was aware of it and monitored Patton closely, intervening when necessary to prevent further incidents. When Patton returned to active field command after D-Day, Eisenhower did so cautiously. Patton was given the Third Army, but his operations were framed within clear boundaries. Eisenhower expected results, but he also expected discipline. Patton delivered both, at least outwardly. His rapid advances across France in the summer of 1944 transformed the campaign. He exploited German collapse, relieved pressure on other Allied forces, and demonstrated a level of operational agility unmatched by his peers. Each success retroactively justified Eisenhower's decision. Critics who had demanded Patton's removal now faced an uncomfortable truth. The general they wanted dismissed was driving the Allied advance. Eisenhower did not gloat. He did not claim vindication. He simply allowed the results to speak. Still, the slapping incidents were never forgotten. They resurfaced whenever Patton clashed with superiors or courted controversy. Eisenhower remained firm. He did not excuse Patton's behavior. He contextualized it. He argued that leadership under extreme stress produced extreme outcomes, and that managing those outcomes was preferable to eliminating the leaders who produced them. Eisenhower's handling of Patton became a case study in coalition leadership. He demonstrated that authority did not always require public punishment. Sometimes it required absorbing criticism to preserve effectiveness. This approach angered purists who demanded strict accountability. It also preserved the operational capacity of the Allied forces at a critical juncture. By the time the war entered its final phase, Eisenhower's decision was no longer controversial within military circles. Patton's contributions were undeniable. The slapping incidents remained a moral stain, but they were overshadowed by battlefield success. Eisenhower accepted that history would judge him for protecting Patton. He believed that judgment would be kinder than the alternative. In private moments, Eisenhower acknowledged the cost of his decision. He knew families had been hurt. He knew trust had been damaged. He did not minimize those consequences. He simply believed that leadership required choosing the least damaging option in a set of bad choices. Protecting Patton was one such choice. As the Allies crossed into Germany in 1945, the controversy faded into the background of victory. Patton remained controversial, admired and criticized in equal measure. Eisenhower remained composed, his authority strengthened by results. The slapping incidents became part of Patton's legend, inseparable from his brilliance and his flaws. What Eisenhower had proven was not that Patton was right. He proved that leadership in war often requires protecting flawed individuals because the cost of perfection is defeat. He accepted responsibility for that protection. He never denied it. He believed the war demanded it. By the end of the conflict, Eisenhower's reputation as a coalition leader was secure. He had balanced egos, politics, and power under immense pressure. He had protected Patton when doing so was unpopular and dangerous, and he had done it not out of loyalty but necessity. This was the deeper reason Eisenhower protected Patton after the slapping incidents, not because he excused the behavior, but because he understood that victory required commanders who could act decisively, even if they were imperfect. He chose results over righteousness, and history would forever debate whether that choice was justified. By the time Allied forces pushed deep into Germany in early 1945, the slapping incidents that once threatened to end George Patton's career had receded into the background of a war that was rapidly approaching its conclusion. They were not forgotten, but they had been absorbed into a much larger narrative, one defined by speed, destruction, and the relentless collapse of Nazi resistance. Dwight D. Eisenhower watched this transformation carefully. He understood that history would eventually revisit his decision to protect Patton, and he accepted that judgment would be complicated, uncomfortable, and unavoidable. Eisenhower had never believed that Patton's redemption would come through apology alone. Apologies repaired relationships, but they did not erase doubt. Redemption, in Eisenhower's view, came through controlled effectiveness. Patton's return to active command was not unconditional. It was a test. Every order Patton issued, every statement he made, every interaction with subordinates was monitored more closely than at any other point in his career. Eisenhower was not shielding Patton from consequences. He was containing risk. Patton understood this, even if he did not always accept it gracefully. His letters and diary entries from late 1944 and early 1945 reveal a man acutely aware that he was operating under probation. He wrote obsessively about discipline, about the need to appear controlled, about the danger of letting emotion undermine authority. At the same time, he remained convinced that war required harshness. This internal contradiction never fully resolved. Eisenhower knew it would not. He did not expect Patton to change fundamentally. He expected him to perform within limits. The final campaigns of the war offered Patton exactly the kind of environment where his strengths could be exploited and his weaknesses constrained. Rapid advances across broken German defenses rewarded initiative and punished hesitation. The Third Army's lightning movements across the Rhine and into central Germany demonstrated operational brilliance. Patton's ability to sense opportunity, to push forward relentlessly, and to keep pressure on a collapsing enemy accelerated the end of the war in the West. Each mile gained reinforced Eisenhower's conviction that protecting Patton had been the correct decision. Yet even in victory, the shadow of the slapping incidents lingered. Patton's public image never fully recovered in the United States. Some admired him as a warrior who embodied aggression and determination. Others saw him as a relic, a man whose intolerance reflected an outdated understanding of human endurance. Eisenhower was aware of both perspectives. He did not attempt to reconcile them. He believed that leadership required accepting contradiction rather than resolving it. As Germany surrendered in May 1945, Eisenhower's role shifted from commander to custodian of legacy. He began to think not just about how the war had been won, but how it would be remembered. The choices he made during the conflict would shape public understanding for decades. The decision to protect Patton after the slapping incidents was among the most controversial. Eisenhower did not regret it, but he did not celebrate it either. He regarded it as necessary rather than noble. In private conversations after the war, Eisenhower spoke candidly about Patton. He acknowledged his brilliance without reservation. He also acknowledged his volatility. Eisenhower rejected simplistic portrayals of Patton as either hero or villain. He described him instead as a force, dangerous if mishandled, decisive if directed properly. This framing reflected Eisenhower's broader philosophy of leadership. He believed that effective command required harnessing imperfect individuals rather than eliminating them. The post-war period brought renewed scrutiny. Congressional hearings revisited wartime decisions. Journalists sought definitive answers. Veterans reflected on their experiences with greater emotional distance. The slapping incidents resurfaced repeatedly in these discussions. Eisenhower did not evade questions. He explained his reasoning consistently. He emphasized the context of war, the pressures of command, and the necessity of maintaining operational effectiveness. He did not deny the harm caused. He simply argued that the alternative would have been worse. Patton himself did not live long enough to fully shape his own legacy. His death in December 1945, the result of injuries sustained in a car accident, froze his image in time. He became a figure defined by contradiction, brilliant and brutal, inspiring and offensive. The slapping incidents became inseparable from his story, cited as evidence of both his intensity and his failure to adapt to the psychological realities of modern warfare. Eisenhower understood that Patton's early death simplified the narrative. There would be no long post-war career to complicate memory. The debate would remain unresolved. For Eisenhower, the experience reinforced lessons that would define his later career. As president, he would again face decisions where moral clarity conflicted with strategic necessity. He would again choose restraint, balance, and containment over dramatic gestures. The slapping incidents taught him that leadership was not about choosing between good and bad options, but between bad and worse ones. Protecting Patton was one such choice. The broader implications of Eisenhower's decision extended beyond Patton. It shaped how the U.S. Army approached leadership in the post-war era. The recognition of combat fatigue as a legitimate condition gained momentum partly because of the controversy. Military doctrine evolved. Training incorporated greater awareness of psychological stress. In this sense, the slapping incidents contributed indirectly to reform. Eisenhower understood this irony. A moment of failure had accelerated progress. Still, the moral discomfort never disappeared. Eisenhower carried it with him. He never claimed that protecting Patton was morally pure. He claimed it was strategically necessary. This distinction mattered to him. He believed that leaders had a responsibility to weigh consequences honestly, even when doing so meant accepting blame. Eisenhower accepted that blame without defensiveness. Looking back, it becomes clear that Eisenhower's decision was shaped by his unique position. He was not just an American general. He was the architect of a coalition that included competing national interests, fragile alliances, and immense political pressure. His primary obligation was not to any single individual, but to the success of the coalition as a whole. Protecting Patton served that goal, even if it offended public sensibilities. The slapping incidents remain one of the most cited examples of ethical compromise in American military history. They provoke discomfort because they resist simple judgment. Eisenhower's role in protecting Patton challenges the assumption that justice and effectiveness always align. It forces a harder question. What happens when leadership demands choices that violate moral expectations in service of larger goals? Eisenhower's answer was pragmatic. He believed that war was not a forum for moral purity. It was a contest of survival. Within that contest, leaders had to manage human imperfection rather than eliminate it. Protecting Patton was an extension of that belief. It was a decision rooted in realism rather than idealism. As historians continue to debate the slapping incidents, Eisenhower's reasoning remains central. His protection of Patton was not an endorsement of abuse. It was a calculation made under extraordinary pressure. The war demanded speed, aggression, and decisive action. Patton embodied those qualities more than any other American commander. Eisenhower chose to preserve that asset, even at personal and political cost. In the end, Eisenhower's legacy absorbed the controversy. He emerged from the war respected for his ability to balance personalities, manage alliances, and maintain focus on victory. The slapping incidents became a footnote in a much larger story, but they remain instructive. They reveal the uncomfortable reality that leadership in war often requires tolerating flawed individuals, because the cost of removing them is too high. This is why Eisenhower protected Patton after the slapping incidents, not because he excused the behavior, not because he ignored the harm, but because he understood that the success of the Allied cause depended on leaders capable of decisive action, even when those leaders fell short of moral ideals. He chose responsibility over popularity, effectiveness over purity. That choice defined him as a commander, and it remains one of the most revealing decisions of the Second World War.